when the process became the problem. There is a point in some fights where the original issue is still there, still urgent, still real, but it is no longer the only problem. That is what happened here. At the beginning, the problem was my health, my pain, my ability to eat, and the treatment I was trying to get recognized correctly. But as time went on, another problem grew around it, the process itself. What should have been a path started feeling like a second injury. The deeper I got into the system, the more I realized that this was no longer just a matter of proving medical necessity. It was becoming a matter of tracking what kind of process I was actually in at any given moment, what each communication meant, what had been opened, what had been closed, what was still active, what had been downgraded, what had been forwarded, and whether the people handling the case were looking at the same story I thought I had submitted. That kind of confusion does something to a person. It creates a strange split between the body and the paperwork. In your body, you know exactly why the case matters. You know what hurts. You know what is getting harder. You know what delay is costing you. But on paper, the case starts getting broken into categories that do not always line up with lived reality. Grievance, appeal, complaint, standard review, expedited review, provider filed, member filed, medical, dental, internal review, external review. Each term has consequences. Each process has rules. And if the system is not handling those tracks clearly, the person in the middle can spend an enormous amount of energy simply trying to understand what is happening. That became part of my life. I was trying to hold the substance of the case steady, while also trying to make sense of the machinery around it. There were moments where I needed to ask whether the issue being reviewed was actually the denial of medically necessary treatment, or whether the case had drifted into a different lane entirely. There were moments where timing changed, but clarity did not. Moments where communication seemed to answer one question while quietly opening another. Moments where it felt like the paperwork was moving, but the truth underneath it was still at risk of being misread. That is when I understood, more deeply than before, that systems do not only fail people by denying them outright. Sometimes they fail people by making the path so unclear that the person has to spend all of their remaining strength just trying to keep the case coherent. And coherence became a full-time job. I had to start thinking not only about what was true, but about what needed to be protected from distortion. If there was a grievance, I needed to make sure it stayed separate from the medical appeal. If there was an appeal, I needed to know what exactly it was appealing. If something had been downgraded, I needed to understand what changed and what did not. If records were said to be received, I needed to know whether that meant they were actually sitting with the right reviewer. If there was a delay, I needed to know whether the delay had been explained, extended, or simply allowed to stretch in silence. The process was no longer a neutral pathway to an answer. It had become something I had to actively watch. That is exhausting in a way that is hard to describe unless you have lived it. It is not just administrative stress. It is the feeling that you cannot fully rest, because if you stop paying attention, something important may slide out of place. It is the sense that the burden of catching inconsistencies has shifted onto the person who is already struggling. It is the knowledge that one wrong assumption, that the case is being reviewed under the correct issue, that the documents are attached to the correct file, that the timeline means what you think it means, can cost time you do not have. And time, by then, no longer felt abstract. The longer the process went on, the more obvious it became that delay was doing its own kind of damage. Not always in dramatic, visible ways, but in cumulative ones. More strain, more uncertainty, more fatigue, more time spent trying to hold together a life that already required too much improvisation. The system treated time like it was elastic, but my body did not. My daily life did not. My health did not. That is one of the quietest and most dangerous things about broken processes. They make harm look procedural. A person waiting on a case can appear patient, or organized, or still under review on paper. But underneath that language is often a very real human cost. The person is rearranging meals, pain, routines, appointments, and hope around a process they do not control. They are trying to stay polite while the uncertainty keeps extracting more from them. They are trying not to spiral while still being asked, implicitly, to trust a system that has not yet earned that trust. I felt all of that. And I also felt something else, Anger, but not the loud kind at first. The quieter kind. The kind that comes when you realize you are being asked to carry too much of the process burden yourself. The kind that comes when a system that should be clearer keeps requiring you to be the one to ask the questions that should already have answers. The kind that comes when you recognize that the process has stopped feeling like a route to care and started feeling like another obstacle standing between you and stability. Still, even then, I did not want to turn into someone reckless or reactive. I knew too much could be lost that way. So I kept doing what the situation seemed to require, documenting, clarifying, separating issues, following up, trying to protect the case without blowing it apart. I was learning how to be firm without becoming messy, how to name the confusion without losing the thread, how to keep insisting that the case be seen correctly, while also trying to preserve relationships with the people who seemed genuinely to be helping where they could. That balance was not easy, because by then I was no longer dealing with one kind of pain. There was the original pain of the health issue itself. Then there was the secondary pain of the process, the uncertainty, the misalignment, the sense that one wrong administrative interpretation could pull the whole story out of shape. I had to carry both at once. And that is when the experience began changing from a private fight for care into something bigger in my mind. I started seeing, more clearly than ever, how systems break people down. Not always intentionally, not always with one dramatic denial, sometimes through fragmentation, through inconsistency, through forcing sick people to become experts in structures they never should have had to master, through expecting endurance from the very people whose bodies and minds are already overextended, through turning clarity into labor and then assigning that labor to the patient. That is what I mean when I say the process became part of the harm. It was no longer just the thing standing between me and an answer. It was actively shaping the experience itself. It was changing how much energy I had, how much vigilance I needed, how much trust I could afford to give, and how many times I had to reassert the same truth in slightly different forms. By then, I knew I was no longer just trying to win a case. I was trying to survive a system without letting it rewrite my story. And once I understood that, the next step became unavoidable. I had to escalate, clarify, and keep the record as clean as I could, because the case was no longer safe in simplicity. The process had become the problem, and now I had to fight on both fronts. How to insist on clarity when a system seems to survive on ambiguity. I was learning how to fight clearly. And once I knew that, I also knew something else. If I ever made it through this in one piece, I would not want all of that learning to end with me.